To appreciate some of the properties of blockchain, it's worth comparing it to the shortcomings of previous architectures, of previous platforms that we've had in the past. One of the first ones, and in general when I speak about the previous platforms, I'm speaking about several evolutions, several generations of the web platform, the biggest platform that we have in the world. And so one of the first ones that I'd like to call out is the question of inclusion. A large part of the world, 2 billion people estimated or so, are not connected to the internet. That means that they do not have access to the educational platforms. That means they do not have access to the global networks when it comes to employment, when it comes to finance, and others such structures that support modern business. They're not participating on it. A lot of the same population is the same population that does not have state-issued identity, does not have properties for their belongings, legal deeds. It does not have a lot of the infrastructure that a lot of the rest of the world takes for granted. Another thing that is worth calling out is that the decentralized nature that the World Wide Web was created with has turned out to be dominated by a handful of very powerful companies. When it comes to email, and this is a great example in that sense, email by design is decentralized. That means that I could run my own email server and so could everyone around the world. However, when it comes to the knowledge, the requirements that are needed for to be able to do that, and just simply the ease with which you can do it, it turns out to be too much. So in a practical sense, there's only a handful of email providers, and you will all recognize what they are. And so because of it, although it is designed as a decentralized technology, the practical realities of that is that there is a handful of servers that represent some of the most dominant companies in this space. The other question that follows on from what I just described is the question of privacy. A lot of the Western governments, certainly here in the United States, have had an ongoing debate as to what is the correct level of oversight of governments. How much access to private communications, how much access to the information of corporations should the government have? And it doesn't matter where you land in this debate, this is something that is very different than what we had in the analog world, and because of it, there is a great deal of debate. Some of them reach out to large political discussions across many different levels. Many different countries take different positions. However, independent of where that position is, the question is how much should be given to the government and how much has the government taken up until this point, and whether there is here some unfairness. Now, similarly to this, there is a question of censorship. For example, if today a large attack is placed on my server, I would need to have great resources to be able to distribute this information that I'm trying to disseminate to multiple geographies, to deal with the denial of service, to perhaps bring in some companies to try to block some of that flood of information. And all of this requires resources. And because of it, only certain organizations can do it. And so that means there is some censorship inherent in the platform that we have. The other one is the provenance of information. There is a great deal of debate about the question of fake news today. And it's a big one. If we think about the foundations of Western democracy, they are based on an electorate, a citizenship group that has access to information that is good information. And if the question of the veracity, the provenance of this information starts to be questioned, then we have some big fundamental questions to address. Now, just in this same breath, we can start to raise the question of security. Most of the information technology networks that we've had up until today have hierarchical, centralized control throughout the world if you have a global organization. If you have a local government, you have the same. If you have a local organization, you have the same. And so if you compromise that centralized control, then you have a serious problem. When it comes to blockchain networks, the proposal has been very different, to provide a peer-to-peer system throughout the world, which is why you often hear that it cannot be shut down because there is no organization that you could serve that court order to. Now, when we flip it around and we use it within an organization or through a government, we have a very different level of robustness and a very different design. And so how we start to take advantage of some of these properties is core to taking advantages of the properties of blockchain. Now, the other one I'd like to call out as well in the same topic of security is that of critical infrastructure. If we think about power systems, if we think about the smart grid or the potential of the smart grid, if we think about the factories, if we think about waterways, all of those are controlled with smart controllers or PLCs, programmable logic controllers. And so a lot of that is starting to be integrated into these networks, which means they run a lot of the same risks. And so this is part of that vulnerability in the current infrastructure. And the last one that I'll mention is the first one that was considered when a lot of these ideas were put forward. Through all that I have discussed, and especially through the populations that don't have access that I have mentioned, the question of exchanges of value have always been done with trusted intermediaries, the banks, the governments. However, we now have a system through which you can have identity, you can have a currency, and you can have logic, smart contracts, be embodied in these platforms. So those without banks, the unbanked can participate. So those corporations can have greater efficiencies, and government can provide a level of services in a way that wasn't possible before. So this is a highlight of some of the core questions and some of the core advantages of blockchain and some of the shortcomings that you should look closely to. Because if we start to give some of those up, how are we different than what came before? And so those are some of the shortcomings to put your finger on and to question when you look at these architectures.